Hello and welcome back to the shed. Is this you struggling with your chisel to shave a bit of timber because your chisel is blunt, chipped, and you don't know how to fix it? Well, in today's episode, I'm going to fix that up for you, and I'm going to show you how to sharpen and hone up a chisel. Before we sharpen, we need to know what sharp is. And then it's the coming together of two planes that are nice and flat, and that'll give us a sharp edge, so we have a cutting edge. That can be then refined up through grits and with a strop to make it nice and sharp. So today, as I said in the start, we're going to be sharpening up this chisel. I'll give you a close-up in a minute so you can see that the edge is actually a little bit chipped on this. It's not very severe, so I'm going to be doing it just using stones today. I have a Tormek over here, which I would usually use, but for the sake of all of you out there that might not have a Tormek or a bench grinder at all, I'm going to go ahead and just do it straight with the stones. The tools I'm going to be using today is, I'm going to be using an Atoma diamond stone. I'll leave a link to that below so you can get it from where I got them here in Australia if you're interested. I'm going to be using the Veritas honing guide. Now, you could do all of the sharpening by hand, but I like to use a guide because it's quick and repeatable results, and it takes quite a long time to actually learn how to hand sharpen properly. So I use the guide. I find it's quick, it's easy, and I don't really find when I have sharpened freehand that it's really that much quicker than using the guide, so I use the guide. And I use a strop and a marker pen if it's needed. So I'm going to go ahead, bring you in, get you a nice close-up on this chisel so you can see what we're working with. And I think this little bit of pitting is quite common on the edge where you've hit a couple of nails or some staples or things like that, and it's just left little chip marks. Also, I find that this can happen with certain hardwoods as well. So this is a really good example of what a lot of you might end up with. So I'll bring you in to have a look at this, and then we'll get to work. So I don't know if you can see this edge here. I'll turn it around that way as well. We have some little pits on there. It might be quite difficult to actually see, but we do have one here. We've actually got a whole series of them. There's like 5 or 6 of them. And we can also tell if we get the light down on top that there's actually a flat spot there, which means it's not sharp. And that is very difficult to show on camera. I don't have the camera equipment to show you that, but just trust me, if you look at any of your chisels or blades that are not sharp, you'll get light reflecting back on the top because you don't have a sharp point on the top. And if you've actually got your chisel sharp, you won't get that light reflecting. So I've got my 400 grit here. I've just got a little piece of timber here set up to hold it. Just held with the hold fast just so it doesn't move around too much. And just a bit of non-slip here to hold it, and this homemade holder jig which I use for the water stones, but right now I'm going to go ahead without that because it's not needed. I like to use a little bit of water to lubricate my stones, even the diamond stones, and we use the honing guide. So I'll go ahead and we'll put the fence on the honing guide. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the honing guide here, but I'm going to do a more comprehensive review of the entire deluxe set that I purchased about 5 years ago now. So you whack this fence on to the thickness of your blade roughly, and you have your angle set here that it's going to be, or you can just set it to what it already is. But I like the repeatable results, so you choose it up here on the yellow dot. Choose your angle here, and that's it. So I'm going with 30 degrees. So you put that on, screw it on, bring your blade in, make sure it's open enough for it to fit through, bring it up on the side here until it hits your stop, evenly clamp them down on both sides, take it off, and we're good to go. Now I know that's set to the angle I want, but I'm going to just use some marker pen here just so it's easier for you to visually see. I use some water on the stones like this, bring it down I can see that it's actually matching it because I know it's the correct angle already anyway. And we start to work it. Now, I try to work all over the stone. Even with a diamond stone, although you don't need to, I like to just move it around so it wears evenly, and I'll even rotate it, which you would do with water stones. You can see just here that we've taken nearly all that marker pen off that was put on here. So we're sharpening right to the edge, so I'm just going to keep going. And you'll visually inspect the back here until your chips are gone. Once you notice that they're gone, you can move on to the next stage. So this is the regrinding process, or the reshaping or the shaping of the bevel, which you could also do with a brand new chisel, which will always come with a 25-degree bevel. So you could use this exact same process to regrind it to whatever bevel angle you'd like. I recommend 30 degrees. Now, if this was really severe, this process would take a long time, and even in this sort of state with a fast-cutting stone like a diamond stone, it can still take some time to actually get any chips out of there. But if it was purely regrinding the bevel, it's going to take however much time it takes to remove that material from your old angle to get to your new angle. So I do advocate for using a grinder. And you don't have to use a Tormek like I have here that I'd use, which is a water-cooled grinder, which is at a slow speed. You could use a fast-speed grinder, but you do have the chance of ruining the temper on the end of your chisel. Or you could use a slow-speed grinder, which has a little lesser chance. And there's also slow-speed grinders with CBN wheels, which, from what I've seen, end up being a similar price to the Tormek here in Australia. However, if you have the option of maybe just refitting a CBN wheel onto a fast speed grinder that you got, the design of those wheels greatly reduces the buildup of heat, so you have much greater chance to prevent ruining the temper on your chisel. But doing it with a bench stone like this, or a water-cooled slow-speed grinder, you have a lesser chance and pretty much no chance of ruining the temper. So now this is done, you will feel a little burr, which is just the metal when you've been sharpening. It sort of rolls over and still attaches, and it sort of just leaves this little noticeable sort of wire piece of metal there. Now, since we're moving on and I'm going to go to the water stones to continue to sharpen this, I'm not going to worry about that burr right now. But between the grits of sharpening on the water stones, you'll see me turn the chisel over and actually remove that. And that just makes it that much easier, so we know that it's actually sharpened right to the edge, because each time you'll be able to feel that wire burr with your finger. It's hard to show on camera, because quite often you're just going for a very tiny burr because you're only just sharpening over the edge. But you will be able to feel it right the way along with your finger. Now, doing this, you've got to be very careful and only push away from the cutting edge. And don't ever push back towards that edge because you could cut yourself. But as you can see me doing here, I'm just wiping away from it, and you can actually feel that burr. What I've got here is some inexpensive King water stones here. I have a 400 grit, an 800 grit, and a 1200 grit, and then I use the strop to follow up after that. Now, you could probably get away with a 400 grit and then a 1200 grit. You're just going to require longer on that 1200 grit stone. And yes, I've used the diamond stone at 400 grit, and I'm going to a 400 grit water stone because I find that gives me a better finish on the chisel than the diamond stone. The diamond stone is a little rougher at all of its grit levels than the water stones. Now, you can use whatever stones you've got, whatever stones you like. I actually have a full set of diamond stones, which is good for sharpening. And this is a 400 grit, a 600 grit, and a 1200 grit in diamond stones. Now, I use them when I'm not in the workshop, or if I'm sharpening things like little tiny blades for plow planes and stuff like that. that is likely to damage the water stones and gouge them out. So my process with the water stones is that I get the stone out because it's left sitting in water. I use my 400 grit diamond stone that I used to reprofile it, and I just give that back and forwards like this. Now all that's doing is ensuring that this stone is flat. Now we're ready to sharpen, and I'll do that every time because I don't ever want them to get out of flat. So it's just a good quick process to get used to if you're using water stones. So the process that we go through here is the same as what I was doing when I was regrinding, except we're going to spend less and less time on each stone as we run through. And the whole process of moving from the grit stone to the next grit is to take out the grit sharpening lines. So you get, with the different grits, you have different grain particle sizes, and it leaves a different scratch pattern on the chisel. So by going from a 400 to an 800 to a 1200, we slowly remove that scratch pattern from the next one, and then I find that after that, using the strop and pulling back on that a number of times is enough to remove that final 1200 grit marking and leave us with a nice polished bevel. Now with the water stones, I regularly turn them, but we probably don't need to spend too long on each grit. So first thing I'm going to do is come in like this, angle it down and push it onto the stone, and we'll pull back and forwards 4 or 5 times. And that's just removing that burr from when we reprofiled. So I've put that marker on here, just here, so we can see where we're hitting the bevel. And this is a technique that I use when I'm freehand sharpening, so I know I'm getting to the edge, but it's still good with the honing guides, just to ensure that you're actually sharpening where you think you're sharpening. So we can come in here and just go back and forwards 2 or 3 times. And we can see that we already removed that marker pen, so we know that we're getting right to the edge. And if you're lucky, because you already sharpened it, you can already feel a burr, and I can already feel a burr there because we've already been sharpening at this grit, so I don't really need to do any more other than a few passes if we want to, but I'm going to keep going for about 10 passes here just to ensure that that scratch pattern from the diamond is the same as the scratch pattern that's actually on this stone. And by doing it a little bit longer on this stone to ensure we've done that just means that it's that much quicker at the next grit. So now we simply move through the grits. This on the angle, push it down, back a few times, feel that the burr's been removed, has been removed. You can put marker pen back on there if you want to. I'm not going to here, I'm just going to keep going until I feel that burr again. We'll bring it down. Now each grit you're going to feel a much smaller burr, and I can actually feel that burr there. It's a very tactile process, so it's something that you've got to do and actually feel for yourself, but your fingertips and actually the feeling is much more sensitive to what is there than what the eye can actually see. So the best way to do it is to actually feel for that burr. So now we're done there, we move on to the last grit, and you can keep going to whatever grit you've got. That's just personal preference, and with whatever stones you're with and whatever methodologies you subscribe to when it comes to sharpening. And you could skip the strop altogether if you really wanted to. I like the strop process, so instead of going up to say a 12,000 grit water stone, I use a strop. You can do whatever you like with this process, but you follow the exact same process. Come in again, feel your burrs removed, keep your stone wet. So now that this is the last stone before I go to the strop, I'm then going to turn this over and remove that burr right here. And then I like to come back, just do a couple of passes, just to ensure that the burr's flipped over both sides and it's gone. We'll finalise that when we get to the strop. So I've gone ahead and I've got my strop here in the vise, just so it's held. I like to hold the strop. If you've got a longer strop, you can clamp it down. Just being careful not to hit your clamp, obviously, but the vise is the ideal spot for it. So the strop I've got here is just a homemade strop. This is 2 or 3 mil leather. It was just a bit of scrap leather that I had lying around, and it's stuck to a piece of 19 mil MDF. You can stick it to whatever substrate you really like, and you know, 3 or 4 millimeters is it's got a good squish to that leather, so it works well for a strop. But you could go a little bit thinner. Just make sure you don't go too thin, because the leather there is very thin, doesn't work very well, and I've tried it before and it tends to tear and not stick very well. With the strops, you can charge them with honing compound. In this case, this leather's not charged with honing compound. It can be charged with honing compound, and I have used honing compound in the past, but I find there's very little difference between having the honing compound and not having the honing compound. It's just the speed at which it hones your blade. Because leather has its own natural grit to it, so that's really what you're looking for when it comes to a strop. So some people like to use abrasive pastes. I always use the rough side of my leather because I find it works better, but you can use the smooth side or whatever you really want to. It just comes down to personal preference after you've tried using it for a while, and you get to decide what you want to do. We can remove the chisel from the honing guide. We don't need it for the stropping process. Just be careful that you've opened it up enough, and when you drag it out of a honing guide like this, that you don't hit that edge and damage it. It's very important you don't want to damage that edge after you've done all that hard work on it. I like to use Paul Seller's method of using a strop, and that is stropping, obviously pulling away from the edge because you don't want to push, you'll cut your leather. But I do that about 50 times. It's as long as you're holding it roughly in its angle and you're sort of locking your body as you're doing it, you're not likely to roll that edge. So if you're a beginner at this and you're getting used to this process, you can bring it in, lift it up until it reaches, and then pull it back, and you can keep doing that each time to ensure that you don't roll that edge, because you don't want to tip it up further and roll that sharp edge over. You want to keep it nice and sharp. So you can bring it in, lift it up until you hit that, and then pull back. And that is going to be more than sufficient to strop that edge. But as you work up to it, you can start getting like this, and you can go quite fast. And we can see now that is a very, very, very shiny edge, and we've taken nearly all of that out, and it's pretty shiny now, and there's not really much in the way of a scratch pattern there. Now, if there was a little bit, you can continue until that's gone. But after this, it will have rolled an ever so slight burr on the back, or it could have. So then I come in like this, making sure to keep it flat. So you angle it like we did on the stone, push it down. And I do that about 5-6 times. Then I roll back this way 3 times, 3 times on the back, then once, and our process is done. So now this chisel is nice and sharp. We're ready to use it and test that it's as sharp as it's meant to be. So I'm going to grab a piece of paper, and we'll show that it cuts paper, and then I'll show you on the end grain of this piece of pine how well it works now. That it's effortlessly cutting that paper. And we'll go on to the angle, and we can see that we can now effortlessly cut this. So in my book, we would call that sharp. So there you have it, folks. That's how you sharpen a chisel that's had chips in it to get it to a nice sharp cutting edge ready for you to be using in a project. The only caveat that I have with this is that you have to ensure that the back of your chisel has already been flattened, or a good inch to the back of it is already honed and lapped and flattened prior to beginning this process. Just so you have a reference of flat, so when you sharpen the bevel, you know it's coming to a sharp point on the end of your chisel. If you like what you saw in this video, and you like my style of teaching, and you'd like to continue to support me, please consider liking and subscribing below. It really does help the channel out. If you'd like to support me a little bit further to allow me to continue making these great videos for you, please consider checking out my newly created Patreon page where you get some exclusive and behind the scenes content depending on what level you subscribe at. Link is in the description and in the channel banner. While you're down there in the description, please consider checking out the links to the tools that were used in this video. And I'd like to put a big shout out there to all of you that have been watching my videos and subscribing this far. I'm really blown away by the response, and I just really would like to thank you. Bye for now.